Chapter 7 in the textbook is about language classification. So up to this point in the course, we've learned about all the layers of language from phonetics through to semantics, but we focused mostly on English for practical reasons. But of course, English is just one of many, many languages. It's estimated that there are about 6,000 to 7,000 languages in the world. So one basic question we want to know is how much does what we know about English transfer to other languages as well? Or stated more broadly, how much do languages differ? And then how do we understand the variation that we see across all the languages of the world? How do we classify them into different groups? What we'll look at in these lectures is that there are really two different ways to classify languages. One is what's called typological classification, which is the current half of the lecture, and the other way is what's called genetic classification, which is the second half of the lecture. So what's the difference between these two ways of classifying languages? Well, I'll start with a very simple analogy. If we think about classifying people into groups, there's two ways that we could do that. Um, One, we could classify people based on their characteristics, right? So we could take people with brown eyes, people with blue eyes, and people with green eyes, right? That's three different groups of people based on eye color. Another way to classify people into groups is by families, right? By their ancestry. So, for example, people who descend from John Smith and people who descend from David Jones and people who descend from Mary Brown, right? Three different groups of people, not based on their characteristics, right? They could have any eye color, for example, but just based on who their ancestors are. And the two ways of classifying languages are similar to these two ways of classifying people. So what's called typological classification of languages, this is grouping languages together based on the characteristics that the languages have. So one example that we've already looked at from syntax a few weeks ago is word order. Right? So languages like English have SVO, subject, verb, object, word order, but there are also languages with SOV order and languages with VSO order. Right? So these are three different groups of languages based on one particular characteristic that those languages have. And then the ancestry type of classifying languages, that's what's called genetic classification. That's grouping languages together based on their parent language, based on what older language they developed from. So, for example, we can classify some of the languages of the world as whether they developed from Latin or whether they developed from Sanskrit. And so this is a genetic classification. It doesn't tell us anything about the properties of those languages, but it does tell us about their history. So this first half of the lecture is about typological classification. This is also just called typology. Okay, so typology is the classification of and the study of the properties that vary across languages. We can think about typology with reference to any different level of structure of language. So we can talk about phonetic typology or syntactic typology or semantic typology, whatever. The overall goal of typological classification or of linguistic typology more generally is to understand what is a possible human language. And by that I mean, if we look across all languages in the world, what are the things that languages can do? What are the things that languages can't do? Right? What properties do we find? What properties do we never find in languages? And also, which kinds of properties are normal, found in lots of languages, and which kinds of properties are unusual and not often found? Okay, we can only answer these questions if we look across many, many languages and compare their properties. So what we're going to look at in this lecture, not a whole lot. We can't look at all the levels of typology across all the levels of structure. First, we'll talk about the idea of language universals, properties that are shared across languages. And then we'll look at morphological typology in particular. So first, language universals. If languages varied infinitely, right, if every language was completely different from every other language, then typology wouldn't really be all that interesting, right? There wouldn't be much to say to compare languages. But what makes typology interesting and exciting is that there are properties that are shared across languages, and these are called language universals. Okay? So a language universal is a pattern or a property that's found across either many languages or most languages or all languages, okay? Regardless of whether those languages are genetically related. There are three different kinds of language universals. So in this part of the lecture, that's just what we're going to look at. What are the different types? So there are what are called absolute universals, statistical universals, and implicational universals. An absolute universal is what might come into your mind when you hear the term universal. Okay? An absolute universal, it's a property that all languages have. Since languages vary a lot, absolute universals are going to be pretty basic properties. So for example, all languages have both vowels and consonants. And so that would be a phonetic or a phonological universal. All languages have at least one voiceless stop, right? So a voiceless stop is a sound like a T or a P or a K. Right? So all languages have at least one of those. All languages make a distinction between nouns and verbs. Arguably, some people have proposed that there are languages that don't, although it seems actually that probably all languages do. It also seems like all languages make a distinction between functional categories and lexical categories. So lexical categories are content words like nouns and verbs, and functional categories are function words like determiners or auxiliaries or complementizers. All languages have pronouns. All languages have hierarchical syntactic structure. So these tree diagrams that we drew to capture the syntax of English a few weeks ago, it seems like all languages, the syntax works that way, right? It's hierarchical, it can be described in terms of tree diagrams. Also seems like all languages have embedded clauses, so the ability to put a sentence inside a larger sentence. That has also been debated, but again, most linguists think it's true that all languages do allow this. The next type of universal is what's called a statistical universal. So properties that are, because languages vary a lot, there aren't that many properties that are found invariably in all languages. A statistical universal, this is a property that's found in most languages. Okay? So it's not truly universal, but it's very, very common. Okay? These are also called universal tendencies or near universals. So if a language lacks one of these properties, then we would consider that to be a rather unusual language. So one statistical universal is having a phoneme T. Right? So almost all languages have a phoneme T, but not all. Another is the existence of nasal consonants. So around 98% of languages have at least one nasal consonant phoneme like M or N. Okay? But again, not all. There are a few unusual languages that don't have a nasal. From syntax, and we saw this in our syntax unit, in the vast majority of languages, in the default word order, the subject goes before the object. Right? So most languages are either SVO, SOV, or VSO. Right? 96% of languages have those orders, and in all three of those orders, S comes before O. Right? In the opposite orders, where O, the object, comes before S, the subject, only around 4% of languages have those orders. Another statistical universal involving syntactic movement, so these are transformations like inversion, right, T to C movement, or verb raising in French, like V to T movement. That's usually upwards or leftwards, right? So if you think of going from T to C in a syntactic tree diagram, C is higher than T, right? So that movement goes upwards. One exception there is affix hopping in English, which is actually rightwards and downwards. So in that respect, English is unusual. Another statistical universal is that front vowels like E or A tend to be unrounded. There isn't any lip rounding when you say E. Your lips are spread wide apart. And then conversely, back vowels like oo or o tend to be rounded. Right? So when you say oo and o, your lips are rounded. And that usually goes together. There are exceptions to this, however. So French, for example, has a vowel U, right? As in the word vue. And what U is, it's a vowel that's both front, the tongue is in the front of the oral cavity, but it's also rounded, the lips are rounded. So this is an example, it's a statistical universal. It isn't always true, it's a tendency. The third kind of language universal is what's called an implicational universal. And these are maybe the most subtle, but also the most interesting kind of universals. So a lot of linguistic properties, it seems like you can take the property or different versions of it and rank it on a hierarchy of how simple the property is or how normal the property is. This hierarchy is called a markedness hierarchy. So an example of this from syllable structure is that you think about types of syllables. So a CV syllable, where you've just got a consonant and a vowel, such as C. That is simpler than a CCV syllable, where you've got two consonants and a vowel, such as ski. that CCV syllable, in turn, that's simpler than a CCCV syllable, right? A syllable that has 3 consonants, like scree. And then, in turn, that is simpler than a syllable that would be CCCCV, right? 4 consonants, such as scree. um, so we can say that we have a markedness hierarchy. Markedness in linguistics means unusualness, right? So the idea is that if something is marked, that's sort of we've put a little asterisk on it to say that this is a strange property. And so markedness, it's just a term that's used by linguists to mean either unusualness or abnormality. So the markedness hierarchy for syllable structure would be CV is less marked than CCV, which is less marked than CCCV, and so on. So a hierarchy like this, we've got a bunch of different structures, right? CV, CCV, that can be arranged on a hierarchy that goes from the simplest or the most normal, which we call the unmarked property, up to the most complex or the least normal property, which we call the marked property. Now, what do these markedness hierarchies tell us about typology? Well, there's a general rule. When you've got a hierarchy like this, if a language has a property that's more marked, then it's also going to have all the properties that are less marked on the hierarchy. So for example, if you take a language that allows a CCCV syllable, right? Well, if you look at the hierarchy, CCCV outranks, it's more marked than CCV and CV. Okay? So if a language allows CCCV, then it's also going to allow those less marked options. It's also going to allow CCV and CV. So this is an example of an implicational universal. Okay, so what that means is that if some property exists in a language, such as CCCV syllables, well, that implies that the language is also going to have some other properties, which here would be CCV and CV syllables. Right? So the presence of a CCCV syllable in a language implies the presence of a CV syllable. If we think of the possible languages that we get out of an implicational universal like that, well, it should be possible to have a language that has all 4 of those syllable types, right? Because if you've got the most marked one, then you've also got all the less marked ones. It should also be possible to have a language that has CV, CCV, and CCCV, right? Because if you've got CCCV, then you must also have the less complex ones, but you don't have to have the more complex ones. It should also be possible to have a language that has CV and CCV, but not the more complex, and then there should also be languages that only have CV. But languages that should be impossible, well, it shouldn't be possible to have a language that only has CCCV and CCCCV syllables, right? Because what the markedness hierarchy says is that if you've got CCCV, then you also need to have the more simple ones, right? So it shouldn't be possible to have a language like this, and indeed it isn't possible. Another example, right, you couldn't have a language that allows CCV and CCCV syllables, but not CV syllables, right? If you've got CCV, then you must also allow CV. And these are similar examples, right? So the last one there, you can't have a language that skips a level in the hierarchy. If a language has CCCCV syllables and it has CCV syllables, well, it also has to allow the one in the middle. An analogy for understanding these markedness hierarchies, the hierarchy is basically like a volume dial, right? If you think of syllable structure going from simple CV to complex CCCCCV, well, all languages at least allow CV, and then different languages turn up the dial to different degrees, right, to have more complexity. So a given language might turn that dial up to CCCV, which means that they have CV, CCV, and CCCV. So there's no way to just pick something higher on that dial. You've got to turn it up to get there, and that means you've got to allow all the simpler ones. Another example of a markedness hierarchy, so nasal vowels are more marked than oral vowels. So what that means is that, right, so we have languages that only have oral vowels, that they take the simplest option. We also have languages that turn that dial up, so they have both oral vowels and nasal vowels. But we don't have any languages that only have nasal vowels, right? Because nasal vowels are more marked than oral vowels. So if you want to have nasal vowels, you got to have oral vowels too. Right? So the implicational universal here is that if a language has nasal vowels, then it will also have oral vowels. Another Markness hierarchy is that voiced obstruents, so an obstruent is a strong consonant, something like a stop or a fricative. So if a language has voiced obstruents like B, then it's also going to have voiceless obstruents like P. Right? Well, that was the implicational universal. The Markness hierarchy is just that voiced obstruents are more marked than voiceless obstruents. What that means is that we do have languages that only have voiceless obstruent phonemes, such as Cree. We also have languages that have both, right? They've turned up that dial to go from not only voiceless but also voiced. But there aren't any languages that only have voiced obstruents. Right? Voiced obstruents are more marked than voiceless ones. So if you want to have voiced obstruents, you've got to have voiceless ones too. Right? So that's our implicational universal.